one last session, which involves an interactive piece. And then we'll just have our closing remarks and end at 11 a.m. Eastern time. So thank you all. Thank you, Nandita, for that excellent presentation. It's clear that there's a lot of excitement around the implementation stories, and we're looking forward to the April 20th launch. So now Liz and I are going to lead this session on partner dissemination opportunities. And I think you've already met us. We've introduced ourselves. In the previous two sessions, we discussed the development of HIP products and the implementation of HIPs. In this session, we'll be outlining the various ways that you, as the HIP partners, can contribute to dissemination activities and efforts. We're going to introduce different dissemination channels and methods. And as we do this, we ask you to think about how your project or organization can engage and contribute to these dissemination activities. At the end of the session, we're going to use Mural, which is an interactive platform that's going to have a little activity to assist you in just gathering your thoughts and reflecting on your commitments for dissemination and how we as the greater HIP partnership can better support you. So to get us started, Caitlin is going to introduce one method that broadens the awareness of HIPs to new audiences. And then we'll hear again from Alex, who will discuss how you can stay up to date on all of the moving parts and activities with the HIP partnership.
All right, feels so much better to stand. Okay, so yes, broadening awareness through meetings. We want to highlight this as a particularly effective strategy that we use for sharing information and for increasing the use of the high impact practice materials. So, you know, in our global family planning and reproductive health community, we use meetings and conferences as a way to bring folks together to share information. And in the HIP partnership, we apply a common marketing principle in bringing the HIPs to our audience, you know, meeting people where they are rather than expecting people to come to us. So decision makers in the field and implementers in the field regularly come together to collaborate, to share information. And we see these as key opportunities to use the HIPs. And I'll give a few examples of how we've done this. Over the years, we've used HIPs as a framing tool, shaping whole meetings around maybe a few high impact practices. We've worked also to include HIPs on meeting agendas. So maybe it's one agenda item that focuses on a particular HIP. And I think, you know, Nandita mentioned this, that oftentimes we see that people are already talking, these are common practices. People are already talking about mobile outreach, they're talking about community health workers, but maybe not framing it as a high impact practice. And we think there is real value in framing these practices as high impact practices. You know, we've done the synthesizing the evidence, and we can say that these are high impact practices, and there's value in branding these things, these common practices, as HIPs. A few ways that we've done this is we have worked with presenters at the International Conference on Family Planning, ICFP. I know IBP network member meetings have had HIPs as a framing tool or, you know, on the agenda. The FP 2020 regional focal point workshops, Laura has worked tirelessly to get HIPs on those agendas. We also have internal USAID meetings that happen on a regular basis. We have an FP programming course that brings together new foreign service officers, people from outside of our Office of Population and Reproductive Health, who are interested in family planning. We make sure that HIPs are on that agenda. We also have, you know, state-of-the-art meetings in years past where we brought people together from an entire region. And those are key opportunities to share information about the HIPs. And the reason that we're highlighting this during this meeting is that we know many of your partner organizations have internal to your organization meetings like this, where you might bring together staff from across the globe, from a particular region, or even from within a particular country. And so we're sharing these examples as a way to maybe spark that creativity and thinking about, what meetings are coming up on your agenda, what's coming up on your calendar, and what are some convenings that might be happening where we could be, as partners, sharing information about the HIPs. So next, I'll hand it over to Alex, who will talk about the HIP newsletter. Alex?
Thanks, Caitlin. So as Caitlin mentioned, our quarterly newsletter began in June 2020. This newsletter is called What's New with the HIPs, and it arose out of development, or the development of this newsletter, arose out of requests from many of our global HIP partners who spoke to the need for having consolidated but comprehensive updates on the many activities and processes that are involved with the high impact practices. So the HIPs production and dissemination team develops and shares this newsletter 4 times a year. And our next iteration will be coming to your inboxes very soon, probably mid next week. Our typical content includes new or updated HIP products, a status update on some of the work being done by the technical expert groups who are updating or developing new HIP briefs, recaps from the various technical advisory group meetings, and links to upcoming or recent webinar, HIP webinars that were hosted. We also announce calls for expert applications here and other engagement opportunities, such as conferences or papers where the HIPs will be featured or have been featured already. So the newsletter is appropriate for both our HIP partners and anyone else who's interested in the high impact practices. So we encourage you to share the newsletter link and sign up and share it broadly with your networks. We are also open to featuring any HIP related content that may link to the work of our partner organizations and others. So please reach out to us either through the Contact Us portal on the website, or you can reach out directly to Laura Rainey and myself, and we'd be happy to talk through opportunities to highlight the various HIP related work that our partners do. Thanks. And thanks, Liz, for putting the link in the chat. I see that down there.
Sure, thanks, Alex. So next slide, we are talking about how the HIP partnership depends on its partners to help promote the HIP products across digital platforms. So the first one, the social media monthly tweets, the HIP P&D team develops and disseminates monthly social media guides focused on specific HIP products and opportunities. And these guides are comprised of about 5 to 10 pre-formed tweets or social media posts, often with like a graphic that you can accompany them. And those are sent to communications teams or point of contacts of our HIP partners, so that they can then send those tweets through their organization's channels. So your Twitter, and maybe if you do Facebook, you can do it through that. And all of these tweets have a common hashtag of HIPs for FP. So instead of having our own Twitter handle, we really like to use this hashtag because it allows all of the different HIP partners to contribute to the conversation and show their support behind it. And all of you new partners, you should have started receiving those emails starting in March. So if you have any questions about the ask, please do reach out from those emails, and we really appreciate your support. HIP partners can also provide direct links from their organization's website to the HIP's website, and this is commonly known as like a website referral. And now we have 2 partners ready to share briefly their involvement in promoting HIPs across platforms. We're calling it the Partner Spotlight. It's rapid fire, very quick. We have Rihanna Thomas representing FHI 360 on the Research for Scalable Solutions project. And she will share about her experience with the HIP social media guides. And then followed by Laura Rainey representing FP 2030, who will share about their experience serving as a website referral to the HIPS website. So over to you, Rihanna.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm representing Research for Scalable Solutions today with our social media platform. And we are so grateful that there are pre-prepared tweets that come to us every month. Thank you, Liz, for those. So we receive those tweets and Facebook posts and whatever other social media posts that they can transform into. And we schedule those tweets out, our social media posts out 2 weeks in advance. And we use this platform called Hootsuite. So there's a lot of different platforms like this where we can schedule our messages in advance. Like many free things, the free features of this platform have become very limited. So we are now partnering with some other USAID social media projects to share our platform. And I think one other thing that I wanted to note is that you can also schedule a post directly on Twitter. So it's just nice to have like a month's worth of these posts that we can reuse. And I go back and actually reuse a lot of the tweets from previous months as well. Just to keep reminding people that this is what the HIPs are. And for R4S, or Research for Scalable Solutions, this is part of our mandate. It's actually to help scale up the HIPs with evidence on cost, reach, and quality. And like Nanitha had mentioned in the survey results, some of our national partners that we were working with on family planning research and learning agendas were not familiar with that terminology, the HIPs itself. So this is actually one way for us to kind of solidify that terminology a little bit more going forward. Open to any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Rihanna. We really, really appreciate your ongoing support and sharing those tweets. And so Laura, over to you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So again, my name's Laura Rainey. I'm representing FP 2030. And as you may know, this was known until a couple months ago as Family Planning 2020. But since we're in a new decade, the name has changed. So FP 2020 is now FP 2030. So we've featured the HIPs on our website for the last 4 years since 2017. And our HIPs webpage highlights new HIPs and associated resources and tools. My webmaster wanted me to say it's a dynamic page. It changes quite frequently. And over the last year, it's received over 1,100 views. The most popular briefs in the last year have been the family planning vouchers and post-abortion family planning. And the page links to the HIP website. And one of the things I wanted to touch on is, why does FP 2030 engage? So the HIPs are one of the core pillars of FP 2030, evidence-based information and data so that country policies and programs are improved through evidence-based decisions. That's one of our 5 core pillars. So to this end, in addition to having the HIPs briefs on our websites, I wanted to tell you about the associated resources that we also have. And one of these resources is implementation checklists that I think Alex alluded to earlier. We have 3 implementation checklists, and they're based on the implementation section in each HIP. And these checklists were developed to engage countries in discussion about what steps might be necessary to implement this particular HIP in their country context. An example is the family planning and immunization integration checklist. The other 2 checklists are immediate postpartum family planning and post-abortion family planning. So they go through the questions a country might need to ask to see, where are we on the scheme of being able to implement this? And they've been used in multiple FP 2020 regional focal point workshops as discussion to start the discussion about the HIPs and these practices. And these associated HIP resources have been downloaded nearly 200 times in the past year. And they were just this week posted also on the HIPs website under resources. So lastly, I wanted to talk about the importance of HIPS to FP 2030. As I mentioned, the HIPS underpin our work. They're one of our core pillars, and they underpin our work with countries. Thus, we've developed another tool using the HIPS called the HIPS analysis, which you can find on our HIP webpage. So the HIPS analysis is a grid or a mapping, and we've created one for each of the 47 FP 2020 commitment making countries. So you can imagine it's a couple pages long and it's color coded. So it's similar to the implementation checklist. The HIPS analysis are meant to help countries start a conversation about their investments and to help them prioritize these investments based on evidence of what works. So each analysis identifies high impact practices in the country's key strategic documents associated with the country's FP 2020 goals. And there's 3 strategic documents: the commitment that each country has made, the costed implementation plan or the CIP, and country action plans. So as I mentioned, for each country on our website, you can find a grid. The HIPS are down the vertical side, and the country strategic documents are on the horizontal side. I think of a bingo card. That's my my graphic for you. And you can see there's in each little box, you can see text which map the HIPS against the country's strategic documents. So you may find that community health workers was mentioned in the commitment, but it's not mentioned in the CIP, and that is a good place for investment because it is a HIP, and you can see just at a glance looking at these documents which investments might be key to prioritize. So they're a tool, these HIPS analysis, to stimulate discussion and inform future country action planning. And again, we've used these in all of our FP 2020 regional focal point workshops, and they're meant to provide a useful summary of potential opportunities and high impact practices in family planning reflected in the key country strategic documents. And in the past year, these individual country analyses, you can get it from Ethiopia, RDC, the Philippines, 47 countries, they've been downloaded nearly 4,000 times. So this is what I wanted to share with you in our partner spotlight. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Laura. So with that, I'm going to start speaking about the HIP webinars. So a very important aspect of the HIPs and the sustainability of the HIPs is showing how they've been implemented in programs and countries, as some of our previous sessions have spoken about. The webinars are a really helpful mode for people to provide context and for people to see and hear real stories about how the HIPs are used in action. So the HIP webinars are convened by the IBP Network and FP 2030. They explore implementation examples through interactive dialogue and presentations from HIP partners, including government perspectives. The aim of the webinars is to reflect the diverse experience in implementing the HIPs in country. And they've been conducted and are available in English, French, and Spanish. Past webinar recordings can be easily located on the HIP website under webinars. And as shared in the previous session, the implementation stories, which are launching soon, are also a new and effective method to share these implementation experiences. With that, I'm happy to showcase our final partner rapid fire spotlight. We're going to be hearing from Tembi Magore from World Vision, who will share about her experience with serving as a presenter in a HIP webinar. Tembi, over to you.
I hadn't unmuted. Thank you, and good afternoon and good morning and good evening to everybody. Thank you for inviting me on this panel. I just wanted to share my experience in participating in a webinar. I was invited by the IBP network to participate as a panelist on the launch of the use of the WHO guidelines and tools alongside service delivery high impact practices that Nandita mentioned earlier and gave us a good example. I received very some guidelines from them on how or what they wanted to come out of that webinar and who the participants would be. I really appreciated the fact that all they wanted from me was to share my experience, tell my story off the cuff without necessarily preparing a very elaborate PowerPoint presentation that seems to accompany webinars. So it didn't take me a lot of effort. What I then went back to, because I was transitioning from the Evidence to Action Project to IntraHealth International, and now I'm about a month old with World Vision, was to just go back and revisit my my trip reports and revisit the process that I had undergone in using both the WHO guidelines and high impact practices. And I shared with one of my colleagues just to be sure that the message that I intended to come out was coming out. So it really didn't take a long time for me to put together my story, to share the experiences. Why was I engaged, or why was I invited to be a panelist on this webinar? I think a couple of things. One is I come from over 20 years of experience in family planning as a trainer, as a programmer, and I kind of reflect back on what the HIPs and what the guidelines and tools mean to me. I come from where there was very, very scanty reference materials that showed evidence. I come from where policymakers or even service providers challenged or expressed skepticism on some of the information that we were sharing in family planning, and that often resulted in what I call provider-initiated medical barriers to contraception, and the need to address that was very important. And also to in working with policymakers and sharing what works and what did not work was always a struggle. I think the second part of it was that I worked with ADOS from the IBP network when we were updating pre-service education curricula in Uganda and Tanzania, and we invited ADOS to those workshops to share what was available, just to put out there the lists of the WHO guidelines and tools for family planning and the HIPs. And like somebody said earlier, the hard copies just flew off the table, and they wanted to get to know more from ADOS. And lastly, I think from my experience, I became a champion because I came back and shared with my colleagues and shared with anybody who could listen how we had used both the guidelines in these activities and the HIPs, and gave examples of having used the task shifting WHO guideline with the CHW high impact practice in South Sudan to influence policy, to influence task shifting of family planning to community health workers. how we use the medical eligibility criteria, the family planning handbook, and the HIPs on post-abortion care or postpartum family planning, in training of service providers, in developing curricula and job aids in countries such as Uganda, Tanzania, in West Africa. So because I was very willing and open to sharing, which I think we should all do, I got engaged to share that experience in the webinar and I think it ties in very, very closely with telling the story of what was used, how it was used, and the results emanating from that. I remember the HIPs, just something that we don't think of, people getting really very excited and motivated when they realize that their own country or their own region contributed to the evidence that was cited in some of the HIPs. And why is it important to all our organizations? I think all of us, and I'm representing all of us and all of us as champions out there, is very important to put evidence in the hands of policymakers, in the hands of service providers, for whether it's in training, whether it's in programming. I think that evidence, while they might say they need evidence to generate evidence in their own countries, it just gives a light touch because they're not starting from zero, they're starting from evidence that is already available. And adaptation becomes easier because they are looking at the evidence, they're thinking, what is the similarity between my country and the other country? And how can we adapt and make contextualize both the WHO guidelines and tools and contextualize the HIPs to our own situation. And I think the other side of it is that it also motivates people to feel that they can contribute. I think for me, it was a motivating factor that the work that I did, which seemed to be very obvious, it was the obvious thing to do at my level, could contribute to not only just disseminating or creating awareness of the WHO guidelines and tools and the HIPs, but also just how best to use them in whether it's for training or for advocacy, or for all the reasons that Nandita shared with us much earlier. And I really would encourage us, because you always get a very positive reaction from the countries when you have not only just created awareness that they exist there on these websites, but taken them through a process where they can apply them, and how to apply them, and how to link, and how to use that evidence and create that evidence. I think the HIPs are very good to use because they are short, they are brief, and they are very much to the point. And that's some of the feedback that I have received. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tembi, for sharing your experience. It's great to hear that you felt like sharing your experience on a webinar was a light lift for you and very valuable to your organization, and you encourage others. So thank you. With that, we are going to move into that interactive activity I promised. So just to wrap up this dissemination session where we've heard about various opportunities to share the HIPs as a partner, we're now asking you to take a few moments to reflect on what you've heard and note it down in our mural board, which will be shared in the chat momentarily. Thank you, Liz. We just are asking you to respond to these 3 prompts What HIP dissemination techniques are you most excited to implement in your work going forward after hearing from these partners spotlights? What could we do to make dissemination easier and more seamless for you? And are there any other dissemination channels that you think we're missing and should be considered? If this is your first time using Mural, it's basically like an online whiteboard. It's similar to Jamboard with Google, where you can just, there's already sticky notes laid out for you if you've already navigated there. Basically, just keep it very short and sweet. Just put down one idea, a couple words per Post-it note. And if you see that someone already has written down the same idea that you have, then you can just add a check mark. If you see on the left-hand side of your screen, click the star icon and then drag it over to the Post-it that you wanted to agree with. So we're going to give you about 5 minutes for this. And as you're doing it, I'm going to be watching and seeing what you guys are coming up with.
And maybe something to share in case anybody is having the same question that I had. At first, the mural board looked really small for me, even if my window was really big. And in the bottom right-hand corner, there is an option of zooming in and zooming out of that mural board. So you can do that and you can grab the mural board and move it around on the screen. So thank you all. This is great. I'm seeing a lot of things that people are excited about. This middle question is especially important. What could we do to make dissemination easier? You know, we have people in the HIP partnership, the moderators of this meeting, for instance, who have dedicated time to put resources together to make this as easy as possible. So if you just continue to share your thoughts on, you know, what would make this easy for you to operationalize some of the ideas that we shared in terms of how to disseminate the HIPs. For instance, I see one that's really helpful. PowerPoint slides that are editable could be useful. That's not something that we have right now. That's a great idea. I see for the third question, are there other dissemination channels that we could be tapping into? Somebody mentioned, you know, reaching civil society organizations. Yeah, I welcome whoever put that up. If you want to come off of mute or share some more details, that would be really helpful for us.
I think along that same vein, not as specific as the CSOs, but someone also put if there's any non-US channels that we can leverage. And I think that's an interesting point to think about some channels that maybe have more popular audience bases in different regions of the world that we could be tapping into. I don't know if the person who wrote that has any specific ideas or if it was more just like a question for reflection. Okay, in terms of what you all are most excited about, it looks like there's a lot of excitement around the social media. So that's great. Adding FP resources section on your project or organization website. Got a check mark there. Incorporating HIPs into webinars. So that's great. Sharing the newsletter. Sharing country-specific examples with HIPs, from HIPs with country-specific colleagues. Thank you all for sharing these ideas. I think we can just give it another minute. And again, if you are someone who wrote something down, a particular post-it that you would like to elaborate on, we have time and the floor is open. You can feel free to unmute.
Just in case anyone missed the original mural board link, you need to open that in order to participate. And it will stay open for a little while even after the meeting, so feel free to reflect further if you have other ideas.